Good morning. It is Monday, November 14th, and the overall topic for today has to do more with climate. I know I've talked about it before, but there's lots sort of vaguely new to talk about. But before I do that, the last recording was on China, and I want to clean up one thing about that, then say something about China and the climate change and the Biden discussion, and then edge more firmly into what's new on the climate front. So the one cleanup I want to make about my last time I mentioned that the Chinese ambassador to the United States was being recalled to join the Central Committee. And a day or two later, it was announced that he might even be a candidate for foreign minister. And I said that this was a good thing for the US because while ambassadors nowadays play a very different role than they did in the days of yore, ambassadors are still important because they network with the country in which they're in, and the Chinese ambassador to the United States would be familiar with the cast of characters in the US government, the executive, departments, congressional people relevant for foreign affairs. And so when such a person returns to their home country, they are a kind of a conduit to how to address issues and the governments to get in contact with and who might be reasonable and so forth. So I said all of those things. It turns out that the current ambassador to the United States, who indeed is being recalled and who indeed may become the foreign minister, is furious and hostile to the United States. I didn't know that 2 weeks ago, because he feels that he was very much mistreated as ambassador. He was not treated appropriately as an ambassador from a major country. He was cold-shouldered. He felt he was insulted. And he apparently is leaving the United States very bitter about the US government, the Biden administration, etc. So what I thought was going to be a good thing in this particular case turns out to be a bad thing, which allows me to then meaning he will not, say nice things or be on good terms with the cast of characters in Washington that as foreign minister or even as member of the Central Committee should be. So what could have been a smoothing of relations, in fact, might make it even more difficult to interact foreign affairs business with the foreign minister if he becomes foreign minister of China. Not good. Chickens coming home to roost. It is not a good idea not to treat ambassadors appropriately to their station, their country, and so forth. Very short-sighted. And that lets me segue into the fact that one of the outcomes, apparently, of the meeting in Bali between Xi and Biden is that Secretary Blinken is being sent over to China for negotiations. That too is interesting because you may recall that Blinken, in this very first meeting with the Chinese, had managed to dress them down and insult them, which was not a way to start relations with China. So now he's going to have to eat crow and smooth things over. And of course, even Biden called Xi, when he first became president, called Xi all kinds of derogatory names. Now, in international affairs, being called by the President of the United States a thug has to be, at the end of the day, forgiven because you have to have relationships. And quite obviously, Xi decided that he was not going to emphasize that Biden that he was meeting with in Bali had called him a thug, but rather that the two would try to smoothen over relations and try to get on a better footing in a number of ways, including matters having to do with climate change. In international affairs, it's almost always better to talk. It's almost always better for countries to know each other well and to know the cast of characters well. And while I think the Biden administration got off to a very bad start with China, it's good that the Bali meeting turned out to be as smooth and as well as it did, and that both the United States and China at this point find it in their interest to try to work together and agree on things that they can agree on, as long as they each recognize that the other is a major power, and as long as the United States doesn't rub it in the face of China that it is the rising power while the United States is, in relatively speaking, in some decline. So all of that is fairly interesting, and more spin-offs of the Bali conference can be talked about some other time. So let me get back to climate change more centrally. We're all aware of the fact that there has been and is a conference in Egypt. And I just want to say in historical context that lots came before this conference, right? And let me go back to ancient times and say that you may have at an earlier age read Rachel Carson's book. And it's still in print, where she warned in the 60s about climate and climate change. It is also the case that the United Nations took note of climate issues. In 1972, an agency of the United Nations was added, the United Nations Environmental Program, it was called, and it was located in the outskirts of Nairobi, Kenya. In part, this was because the UN likes to distribute international agencies around different parts, and too many of them are lodged in Europe. And as the rest of the world rose and became more important, it became increasingly important to have some of the specialized agencies in other parts of the world. And in any event, Nairobi, Kenya was selected for the Environmental Protection Agency. So in 1972, that one opened under the leadership of an environmentalist, among other things, Maurice Strong. And the subsequent head of that agency, later in the 70s, was actually an Egyptian engineer. Just out of personal interest, I actually went to interview and to study and write about that agency's the UN agency Environmental Protection Program in the 1970s. And at that particular point, the focus was on desertification, because it became obvious at that point that the desert was increasing in scope due to early climate change of one kind or another, and that was a major problem on the African continent. Subsequently, there have been all kinds of conferences through the years. One to point to was the Rio conference in the 1990s, 1992, I believe, in Rio de Janeiro. And at that particular point, one of the topics that came up was that late developing countries, former colonial countries, and so forth, said that they needed help, financial help, to address climate issues. And many countries, including the United States, made noises that they would be willing to finance and help, and it really never materialized, right? And over the years, you then had, the Kyoto conference, the Paris conference, and so on and so forth, highlighting environmental issues and highlighting promises to help countries who themselves were not able to do much about the climate change that was visiting on them. But this issue of what to do between the polluters versus those that are the victims of the pollution internationally has been a central part of this particular conference in Cairo. Now, it should be said that of all the pollution, and there are lots of statistics in the world, it's generally agreed that only about 7% of the pollution of hydrocarbons, etc., actually comes from the poorest countries like African countries, right? So these countries say to themselves, we are having huge climate change problems, but we're not the one that have caused the climate change at all. We are just the victims of climate change. And the countries south of the border in particular, south of the, I don't mean border, south of the equator in particular, have had early and devastating consequence of climate change without themselves having been the cause of climate change. That does not mean that countries in Africa and elsewhere don't also need to contribute to cleaning up the air, not doing harmful things to the environment, but it just is a sense of proportion. The other thing is that statistically, when there's discussion of emissions, everybody knows that the United States and China are the biggest emitters, and that also that India, another big country, also seems to be a big emitter. I'm sorry. Well, yes, that is true. The problem, of course, is that you need to not only look at the total emissions that a country is producing, which is relevant for global climate change, but also how to rectify these things internally. And when you look at the internals, it is, for example, the case that, let's say, both China and India, who both emit a fair amount of pollution. China, the greatest amount, 32% of fossil fuel emissions. You also have to look at per capita. That is to say, per capita, the Chinese actually individually contribute less to fossil pollution than Americans do, right? So there are all kinds of sort of things to look at other than just the statistics. The Chinese do the most hydrocarbon pollution emissions, fossil fuel emissions. Yes, they do, but per capita it's lower than Americans, even though Americans have a much lower percentage. And of course, we have a much smaller population. So one has to be careful, not only in accusing countries of being the problem, but also to see how you rectify things in different countries under different socioeconomic circumstances. So let's just reel forward and say some of the biggest victims of climate change are in fact African countries, which of course is one of the reasons, not the only reason, why this conference is taking place in Egypt. They're having two problems. One is huge droughts, for example, in the Horn of Africa, and the other is huge water shortages, and the third is flood issues. So simultaneously in this past year, you have had devastating droughts in parts of Africa, and at the same time, you had these huge and devastating floods in Nigeria happening on the same continent, all having to do with global warming, having to do with not enough water in some places and too much water and rising oceans and rivers in other parts. So the complexity of this from part of the world to another part of the world is very serious. And one of the things that the poorer countries are saying, yes, we're all in favor of doing something, but we can't really afford to do the remedial stuff that is necessary. First, of course, it's not our fossil fuels that are creating the problems. It's yours, industrial countries, number one. And number two, you, the industrial countries, have better position to do remedial work because you can afford it if you're so inclined. We actually can't afford it, which is why the loss and damage, which has been used over and over again at the meeting in Egypt, has become so central. because the countries are saying, we are the victims. The damage has been done to us, even though we haven't caused, we're not behind the cause, we're not the cause. And have been the victims of these losses, human losses, land losses, productivity capacity losses. Help, help, we need financing. So that's become the very central this time at this meeting in Egypt. Now, several countries have in fact stepped forward, including some European countries, in saying, yes, yes, you're right. We need to allocate resources to the poorest countries so they can address the damage that's being done through the climate change, which is not their fault, but of which they're now the victims. Other countries have been less wanting to be addressing these damages and the loss and damage issues. Interesting, the U.S. is at the forefront. I don't know if you've noticed in the press that our environmental representative, former Senator Kerry, has been one of the people who has spoken for the United States and says, yes, we're willing to help, but we're not willing to buy into a policy of loss and damage. And one of the reasons, or maybe even the main reason, why the U.S. has taken this position is because they're afraid that if the U.S. says, yes, we are responsible for the damage, that in fact, individual countries or cities in third world countries or even companies and individuals might then sue the United States for the damages they've caused. And the U.S. does not want to get involved in legal hassles with countries who are saying you adopted a resolution for loss and damage, so you're causing damage and we want to sue you as a country. As an individual country for the damage that you have contributed to. So there's a kind of long-term legal position that the U.S. is taking, while at the same time making noises in any event that they would be willing to think about some voluntary compensation. And here, I think it's fair to say that President Biden's address at the Egyptian conference, it's COP25, has made all kinds of noises about all the kinds of things that the U.S. has already done and that his administration have done. Well, some things have been done, but quite a few of the possibilities of helping to fund countries to deal with coping with climate change are stuck in Congress and may never get passed. So while it sounds a lot better than it actually is to the ears of countries who, seriously need some kind of help with food, with damage control, with building in protections, and so on, a lot of it is still on the table and wishful thinking and rhetoric rather than anything that they can count on. So I'm presenting a fairly negative picture about this conference that has taken place, but actually lots of sort of positive things have taken place. Namely, the agenda item of loss and damage has now made it to the top of the agenda. And who and what countries have been at the forefront? Well, island countries in the Caribbean, island countries in the Pacific, countries and islands and various other places in the world. And, different people rise to the top in leadership under new issues. For example, one of the leaders on environmental issues in the world right now is a woman called Mia Mottley, and she is the Prime Minister of Barbados. And she has become a very important figure in the discussion of all of this. sometimes small countries have leadership. For example, over the law of the sea negotiations in the 50s and 60s, the leadership came from Singapore, of all places, tiny little country. So sometimes representatives from small and somewhat neutral countries, but in any event, countries who are also interested in the subject, can have more leverage than the big players in corralling people and trying to do the right thing. What else can be said about COP27? Lots of promises were made in Glasgow. Lots of promises were made in Paris. Is there any hope that anything more will come out of the COP27 conference? I think one can be modestly optimistic, and the reason is that climate change and its impact has become as serious as it has. It's serious in the sense of floods and storms, for example, Florida. It is serious in terms of the incredible flooding of 1/3 of Pakistan, for example. It is serious in the case of flooding in Nigeria, for example, and it will take billions and trillions to help rebuild those societies. So a reasonable person can make the argument, why not try to move more quickly up front in trying to find remedial things, not just reducing global warming or the impact of global warming, and to do something about reducing the fossil fuel emissions and so forth, but also to do something about the cutting up of forests in Brazil and elsewhere, and do something about reforestation in various parts of the world. So one of the things is not just to keep whining about the horrible things that are happening and laying blame around, but actually becoming more activists, both internationally and nationally, about recognizing that the agenda items are not just bureaucratic reports, but need action on the part of everybody in the world. How much improvement will be seen in the next year or two of taking remedial action, both by slowing down global warming, but also by figuring out various remedial things. And on that front, actually, lots of positive things are happening. There are lots of countries that are trying to figure out how to cope with the situation. Even a country like Germany is trying to figure out how to reconfigure and manage the Rhine River, which is incredibly important in Germany in terms of its internal as well as external trade. It is a much used commercial river. There are very busy countries, islands, non-islands, that are busy planting, reforesting one way or another. There are big projects afoot in many countries, forefront of some industrial countries, of how to manage flooding or how to prevent it. One of the sort of silly aspects of the disasters on both the east and the west coast of Florida is that people are thinking of rebuilding. Well, hello, you can't rebuild in the same way in the same places, because the whole thing will happen again. There'll be similar floods. Countries like Holland, which were at the forefront of figuring out how to build when seas rise, are now also trying to figure out how to deal with drought in various parts of Holland. So there's a lot of research going on, but it also takes not only a recognition that you're maybe part of the problem of causing global warming, but that you also might be the solution, both in your own country and solution for other countries, of how we're going to get through the next 20, 30, 50 years when global warming might be slowed down under the best of circumstances, but certainly won't stop. That leads me to just say, we keep reading about the 1.5 centigrade that we have to stay within. And if we go over that before 2030, we're going to, have global warming and the effects of global warming that is unbelievably devastating. Well, to our American ears, 1.5 centigrade doesn't sound like a lot, but go to your computer and translate that into Fahrenheit, and you will see that it's a whole lot of Fahrenheit degrees. So rather than telling you, well, do a little research and look up what 1.5 centigrade is in Fahrenheit. It is not funny. And almost everybody believes that given the current pollution and the pollution that is made worse because of the increase in burning fossil fuels because of Ukraine and all of that, that things will probably go over 1.5. And so remedial issues are becoming as important as slowing down global warming, because we're already at a point where there's serious damage, as I just mentioned, in several countries, but also in other countries. And then there are a series of countries which know for a fact that even at 1.5, the level of global warming is such that they can't continue as they currently are. Bangladesh is one country, very low lying, lots of the flooding will get rid of a very large chunk of the country. They've got to do something in a big hurry. So when the countries of the southern hemispheres argue about loss and damage, on the one hand, major players like the US may not fork money over under that rubric. But on the other hand, the fact that loss and damage has to be addressed has become a major agenda item in Egypt. One of the ironies, let me finally say, of the conference in Egypt is not only that Egypt is a very authoritarian country, but that of the 65,000 people jailed, political opposition jailed in Egypt, there is a fair chunk of people who were environmentalists. So Egypt is not only not very good about its environmental policy, but it also punishes activists on the environmental front. And on top of that, Egypt, while it's talking big at this conference, is in fact doing all kinds of disastrous things in Egypt itself. For example, by taking a few green islands that are green and converting them to buildings and hotels and tourist sites and so forth. So Egypt is not only a role model government or a society that is governed well and in a non-authoritarian fashion, but Egypt itself, in terms of its environmental policy, is in considerable difficulty. First, because it contributes to undermining its capacity to fight environmental impact in Egypt itself, and second of all, because it is dependent on grain imports. We talked before, the very 70% of the grains in Egypt, I believe, came from Ukraine, Russia. And so it's very dependent on the production of food in other parts of the world. So all the more reason why Egypt should be mindful of environmental matters at home and should be a big contributor to trying to do something about climate change. Egypt, of course, would say, well, we're holding this conference, that's a contribution. Anyway, stay tuned on climate change and environmental matters. For US policy, it will be interesting to see what exactly the next Congress looks like and to what extent Congress is willing to play ball with developing reasonable domestic as well as international policies on climate change, other than just rhetorical or mainly rhetorical. So that is an important consideration from the perspective of the U.S. And second of all, I think all these conferences over the years have made lots of promises and none of them been held. But I think we've reached a crisis point where there might be a push to take more seriously that something needs to be done and not just rhetoric. Thanks very much for listening. See you in a couple of weeks.